Oh, I should pull up the.
Yeah, they even started like that Windrider company. And did Windrider like is it actually gonna like continue to exist? Do you think the one that did Amun-Re or not Amun-Re?
Ra
and Tigris and Euphrates.
Yes.
Didn't they do a third one? Maybe not.
Not that I know of.
I feel like because of the whole Asmodee situation, they might. I don't know if they're going to keep it going or not.
Yeah, who knows? Z-Man's new edition of Through the Desert, which itself used to be distributed by Fantasy Flight, does look like it could be a Windrider game, but that's just a graphic design issue.
It doesn't. You don't think it looks like it could be?
No, graphically it looks like it could have been released by Windrider. It has this similar kind of aesthetic in a number of ways. But
what was your thought? So if you played the new Tiger, I think you're pretty high up on Tigris and Euphrates, right?
It's my favorite game.
Yeah. Okay. What is your thought on the Fantasy Flight version?
It's good that it's in print.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense because it is. I feel like it's about inferior to the Mayfair and whatnot. All those other games, all those other productions of it, in just about every way you can imagine.
I mean, it's perfectly functional. Look, I prefer wood to plastic, all things being equal.
Yeah.
The tiles are differentiable. I mean, the worst thing you can do in an edition of Tigris and Euphrates is make it so that you can't parse the board state easily by virtue of the tile design.
I thought it was a little tough to tell. Were you saying that the tiles are easy to tell apart or not?
I thought it was fine, to be honest.
Okay. But I thought it was a little bit like Mayfair, I think, looks a little bit just more like simple. But I honestly do think that the Mayfair's or the Fantasy Flight one, to me, looks more like something that you'd see in a history book. But because of that, it's like I don't see from across the board as easily as I do with the Mayfair version.
I see.
I don't.
I have the Pegasus printing, which is not one of the more common ones. I don't think it ever saw an English release. And that's my preferred. There's always a balance to be struck between usability and the aesthetics of the tiles and how garish you want the color palette to be. And obviously opinions will differ on that score. So it used to be the case back in the day. The big doctrinal difference was between the Mayfair versus Hans im Gluck. And I think dozens of people died over those conflicts. So I'm glad we put that to rest. But
nice.
I'm just going to turn my camera off to preserve bandwidth. I apologize if that's on.
Oh, no, that'd be just fine. Nobody's going to be too bothered by it. Looks like TC's radio silence right now anyway. I'm just in the process of posting on the guild.
I'm glad, Mark, I saw your picture because I recognize you from videos. Didn't you do the all your games are bad?
All the games you like are bad.
Yeah, I think you did one I watched on Scythe that I got a big kick out of.
Well, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, as I was like, oh, here's a different opinion. Click, and I started watching. I'm like, oh, I like this guy. This guy's awesome.
Yeah.
So I didn't even know this was you. So cool. I get to talk to you. Hi, I like your videos. You're awesome.
Don't tell him, man. If you tell him that, he's gonna go away forever.
No. We want him back. We gotta flatter him and like say he's cool, so he'll come back on the Longview more.
I tried that. He went away forever after I did that. This time, it's just gonna be tough love.
Okay, how about this? Your videos suck.
Sure.
All your videos you like are bad. Yeah.
Well, then I've got good news for you, TC. You're not going to get any more of them. So
they are actually a thing of the past. Then, huh?
You had the cool Baratech fighter on the shelf. I remember that. You big Robotech.
How dare you, you degenerate, illiterate monster!
Hey, I grew up on Robotech. Later, I knew it was Macross, but when I was growing up, it was Robotech. It's just the way it is. I know Harmony Gold is a heartless, evil empire, but I can't help it. When I was growing up, it was Robotech.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. I first got introduced to Macross through Robotech too, but anyhow, yeah, no. I don't know. I might do another video at some point. I'd like to do a follow-up on Secret Hitler because after playing the game about 40 times, my opinion has somewhat shifted.
What direction?
More negative. Specifically, the issues that I had with it initially in terms of luck, I underestimated the effect that it would have on the game state. Repeated patterns have shown up that I probably should have noticed after playing it the first 20 times that I didn't, but playing it another 20 emphasized that there are these breakpoints in the game where either one faction or the other has to make their push. And if the deck doesn't give them the tools to do that, then the game can lock. And that's not good.
Well, you know what, Mark? That is one of the beautiful things about your approach, and it's something I really respect, is that your opinion is never necessarily set in stone, but if it does change, you're going to give people a good reason. I just can't stop to think of why in the hell anybody would give so much thought to a variant of the Resistance.
Because the Resistance is one of the greatest games ever made.
It is. I would actually agree that as far as like purity of social deduction, it certainly is. What are your thoughts on Avalon, though?
Yeah, and I mean, if you lack the ability to have friends or deduce, then I can understand why it wouldn't be up your alley.
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I like the Resistance, but it's quite a lot of time and thought you've dedicated just to a variant. I mean, it's not the Resistance.
Sure. The problem is that in the place where I live, no one wants to play the Resistance, but everyone is willing to play Secret Hitler.
No, because it's new.
Is that just funny because it's new, or
no? Because because it's less deterministic and less tense.
Well, okay. I did predict in 2018 we would see softer games, so maybe this is a trend after all.
Yep. I'd say that we all sit on the same side of that debate, maybe. Well, Mark, it is just an absolute pleasure to hear from you. And it just already in the first 5 minutes, I think we've already gotten to a point where I'm like, yep, I could do this. I could do this on a weekly basis. You want to come back? What are you doing next week about this time, huh?
I'm at your disposal, Joe. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Awesome. You notice he's not at my disposal.
Well, he doesn't know you well enough. And you already offended him on that thing that I couldn't even understand earlier.
Oh, that's true.
I just met TC, but I'm sure I'll grow to dislike you on a personal level before too long.
That's you. Take long. It's like the sort of I hate it, but I can't look away feeling.
Sure. I will say, gentlemen, if you're eager to hear more of my misanthropic ramblings, I do have my own podcast now.
Yes.
Which is called So Very Wrong About Games. I do it with a friend of mine by the name of Mike Walker, who sometimes manages to rein in my sardonic, hate-fueled nonsense.
Oh, that's the best part of you, Mark. Hey, that's why I love your videos, man. I mean, I hate you. We don't want you back.
There you go. Yes, TC, you're figuring this out.
Am I doing good, Joe? Doing good, Joe?
Yep. That's right. No, I seriously, I am really looking forward to like binge listening. Once you get a handful of those, I'm just gonna binge them because that's how I do it, man. I do it with a whole bunch. And believe it, Mark, this talk already has got me putting them on the download. I'm pressing the download button so I can then delete them without listening to. In anger in the middle of this episode too.
But he still gets credit if you download it, so it kind of doesn't matter. He still gets.
Yeah, at that point, I've already helped. Yeah. I have. Yep. Which I mean,
just listen to it without downloading it.
We got to figure out if we can or not. But yeah, I don't got anything for that. Oh boy. So, well, guys, are we ready to start this? Get this.
I am ready to go.
Chariot race going.
Yeah.
All right.
It's the most interesting people, Joe. It's like, oh, I know this guy. Oh, wow. What do you know?
Yeah. Believe me, man. I've met Mark through his videos, and as soon as I listened to him, as soon as I watched them, I was like, all right, let's find this guy. And Mark joined us on The Good, the Bored, and the Ugly. Oh boy, what was that like? I feel like that was like a year, 2 years ago, year and a half. It was a while.
It couldn't have been more than a year ago, I don't think.
Okay, so a year ago.
That's
about a year ago. And yeah, ever since we had Mark on for an episode, and it was just wonderful. Dealing with all the technical difficulties was a joy.
All my fault. 100%.
Yeah, and I would say that it's kind of like the sort of like scream therapy that I've heard is this new age thing where, you pay someone to like derage you. It's like walking into the Monty Python sketch where it's like, I came here for abuse.
Look, I only hate games, not people.
That's true. That's
okay.
True.
I also hate people who like bad games, but that's a minor exception.
Holy crap! I'm in trouble.
I was letting you get away with murder by just agreeing to that, Mark, and I'm glad that you at least self-corrected there, because otherwise I was going to dial you in here to no. We were going to start listening to clips. I was going to start playing clips.
as ever, Joe, I'm a slave to the truth. And
yes, that's right. And I'm wondering when is going to be, how many minutes in here, TC? We need to take bets over under 15 minutes on when Mark is going to first forgive us.
I'm not in that business anymore. I don't forgive people anymore.
Oh, once he finds out the game I've been playing this weekend, I think I'm going to be beyond forgiveness.
Confess your sins, TC.
Yeah, it's at this point.
It's you ever play? I mentioned this on the Good, the Bored, and the Ugly. But do you ever play a video game called Deadly Premonition?
Oh my God! Oh no! Oh
no, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, they made a board game out of this train wreck, and I have it. Yes. And it's just as bad as you think it could be. I cannot wait to discuss it Thursday. It's going to be great.
So I'm wondering, to me, making a board game version of Deadly Premonition sounds about Hollywood now making first a book about the movie The Room and now a movie about the book about the crappiest movie of all time. So is it a winning formula? Is it self-conscious or is it self-aware enough to actually be, I guess, to be able to carry blame? Because that's, I think, the issue those things run. The product themselves can be, blameless because of how oblivious they are. But
I will let you wait till Thursday.
All right.
I will say this: you get a roll card that has nothing to do with the game. In the instruction book, it says you're encouraged to role play this character for no reason whatsoever. I kid you not. It's in there. I can't wait till Thursday.
Variable player powers. Yeah.
It's and the designers, I've never designed a game before, as far as I can tell. They don't even exist on Board Game Geek. This is an absolute gem of a game, man.
Well, Mark, I think we've finally found the game to get you back into doing videos. Welcome back. Okay. All the games you like are bad.
Yeah, because I really think
Mojo version 2.
I can just see it now. The population online and on Board Game Geek is looking at this video game tie-in of Deadly Premonition, and they're asking themselves, is this good? This is probably good, right? I need critical opinion to weigh in on whether this is good.
well, I can say right now the biggest selling point of this game so far has been the game came with a poster with a map on the back that you just used in the video game, and Liam, my son, has put it on the wall because he likes it. So there's something positive that yeah. And it was a Kickstarter stretch goal. Anyway, we'll get into it on Thursday. I can't wait. I'm very excited.
Every time TC's looking at the silver lining, it always just makes me shake my head worse.
This was a Kickstarter game? I'm shocked.
And it made all the stretch goals. It made all of them.
Hey, Mark, we've got Norm in our comments here, and Norm actually is from Saskatoon, so you guys are both up there north of the parallel. Actually, yeah, I think you dipped south of that parallel, don't you?
Yes, here in Southern Ontario, we do indeed kind of jut into your geography, as it were. But
get out of my yard!
Well, look, you guys invaded us 3 times in 3 separate instances, and we beat you back all 3 times. So suck it.
That is beautiful.
In the immortal words of Rick Mercer, one of our Canadians, we're bigger and we're on top. If we were in prison, you'd be our bitch.
Oh!
Yep. Well, welcome, Butch.
I'm sorry, was there a question there?
Well, welcome, Butch. I suppose. Yeah, it's.
Well, what does Norm have to say? Let's hear what Norm has to say rather than a couple of Americans yammering on.
1812. So I think he's coming right there with you. Did I shared the pop-out chat with you there? If you look in our window for the Hangouts.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay, and then you should be able to see it. And that way you're not wasting bandwidth by actually watching it on the watch screen. Because that's right now we're broadcasting live, but it's about 10-15 seconds behind. So whenever you say something out loud, if you type it, it'll be immediate. But if you say it, it's going to be a bit of a delay. Yep, and it sounds like we have a celebration here from Norm, and that is that his son Daniel from their videos, Daniel and Daddy, they do some awesome videos you should check out where Norm and Daniel do videos of like how to play and just it's just an absolute blast, really really fun. Daniel is cancer free.
Hell yeah!
That is the type of news we need right down here when we are dealing with, one of the coldest winters, the coldest New Year's on record. I appreciate, and I am here sharing in the good vibes there, Norm. So tell Daniel we said keep it up, young man. He's everybody's superhero. He's my superhero.
Anybody that fights cancer is a freaking superhero. That shit sucks. Pardon my French.
Okay, thanks, TT. You're gonna edit that out, sir. You're gonna play the bazooka, and I'm sorry if Daniel's here listening to it.
I'll attempt to do it and get in trouble because I won't. I'll forget.
All right, so we're gonna talk about Tribune here, and if you guys are ready, we could do a little bit of a countdown. TC edits these, Mark, and he just can put he's got every single thing you can imagine pre-recorded. I'm pretty sure he has fart noises for every time I don't say something for at least 3 seconds, so you can just put one in, just slide one through.
Only at the beginning when I edited the intro.
Yeah. Do you want me to be recording on Audacity on my end?
Nope, we got it all covered on our end.
This stabilizes, and it's been you don't have to worry about it. So it's gotten a lot easier and just much more user-friendly with Google Hangouts. So
great. Yes. All we require is your time, Dave. That's all we require is your time.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I want you to be yourself, sir. I don't want you to be, let's see here. I want you to put, what is it? Keep it strong. Keep that backhand strong.
It's charming that you think that I'm even capable of editing myself ever.
That's my job.
No filter. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. It's that's what we got Mark on here for. So let's go ahead and let's get this kicked off, and we'll be able to. I've got my my list of questions that I asked you here, Mark. So I'm going to hold you accountable, sir. And and we'll kind of use that. The thing is, that's intended as a loose outline. Anytime you want to go off record, absolutely be happy to, especially if it in some way marginalizes my co-host.
Absolutely.
You got it.
That's what TC's here for. All right, so 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Longview. Tonight we are going to be talking about Tribune, a game that came out originally from Heidelberger and made its way to the States in several different versions. And we got a extra special guest host and expert on Tribune. He's definitely an expert. Don't let him tell you any different. And he's done some other projects in the past. You may know him from All the Games You Like or Bad, a video review series. I know him as my arch nemesis and also a best friend somehow, and that is Mark Bigney. Mark, how you doing tonight?
I'm quite well, Joe. How long have you been a flagrant liar?
Since I've known him.
Fair enough.
Everything there you just heard, absolutely a lie. Well, you may have done All the Games You Like or Bad, but that was in a former life, and we don't talk about that anymore.
No. Now I am the co-host of the weekly podcast, So Very Wrong About Games.
Absolutely. And check that out to hear more from Mark. You will know very quickly, maybe within the first 20 seconds. Maybe you already know whether or not you're really going to check that out. But yes, Mark delivers, and I am looking forward myself to being one of your avid listeners, my friend. So anyway, we're here to talk about Tribune, and it's not just me. It's also TC. TC. This is a game from Fantasy Flight Games at one point, but it's not like many of their other games. However, it sounds like you've this has become a bit of a grail game for you.
Yes, I became aware of this game quite a while ago. It's an older game, I think. When did this thing come out?
2007.
Yeah, it's kind of a grail game for me because it's one of those games I've heard a lot about. A lot of people play. I'm like, ooh, I'd like to get this, and I can't find it at a decent price. So it makes me sad. Makes me a little sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to send you, the next time that you're having a bad day, I'm going to send you a picture of me with my copy holding it like this. Like, hey, TC, remember?
That'd be great. If you could just do that, like every time I'm feeling bad, that would, at least it knows that maybe at some point in the future, in the far future, it may have a chance to play it.
Oh, no, TC.
Oh, no. Really? Okay.
No.
I hate you.
And the implication is that I bring the vitriol to this situation.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You know what? You just before you, Mark, we were cool. Me and TC got along well. You listened to our previous episodes, and yeah, we were gonna make this last, dude. I think you're just gonna have to rule over the split proceedings here. You've got yourself here. You now have become like the pivot, Mark, and I don't know, man. I don't know if you're ready for this.
Do you always bring on guests to your podcast to scapegoat them shamelessly for your own interpersonal problems?
Yeah, otherwise we could just do it by ourselves. What else are you here for?
I'm glad to be useful.
Well, you're useful for more than just that. We will get to that later on. But first, Mark, could you tell me about how you first got into playing Tribune, and maybe a little bit about what you know of your history and just any history of the game, how you figured out about it and whatnot?
Sure. I was first introduced to the work of the designer Karl-Heinz Schmiel through DMocker. When I first started in the hobby, like many people, I started with lighter Euros. I was first introduced via Carcassonne. That was my gateway game. And
what was that? I'm sorry. Could you say that one more time?
Sorry, Carcassonne.
I think that Norm probably here in our comments probably loves your pronunciation, because I know that Norm is a French Canadian. So you have just made yourself another friend, which he's just gonna hurt you, Norm. Don't even.
Yeah. Anyway, so I was getting into heavier and heavier Euros, and DMocker at the time, this was in the early 2000s, was sort of the epitome of weight. That just goes to show you what a different market we had back then, when DMocker was the heaviest thing imaginable, because it lasted all of 3 or 4 hours. Could you even believe of a game that lasted that long? It was a simpler time. We were young and naive. And so I played DMocker. I really enjoyed it. And I was early on starting to get a feel for, chasing down a designer's past works to see what else they'd done. And that introduced me to Vashtikt, which was his trick-taking game, which is very interesting and weird, like many trick-taking games are. And when Tribune came out a few years after I was exposed to DMocker, I'm like, oh, Karl-Heinz Schmiel is doing a worker placement. Let's see what this is. And so it was purely on the strength of the designer. And I originally brought in the imported a German copy because it was language independent. And that was before American distribution had been announced. And so I've been playing it ever since. I had it at launch, and it's been a permanent part of my collection.
Microphone, Joe.
I hit the button. Why didn't it turn on? I'm sorry.
That's my job. See what my job is? Tell him his microphone's off.
Good job.
I'm on it.
Thanks, TC. So, wow, it sounds like you've got quite the history from kind of day one here, and Tribune is among your favorite games, as I recall. Where would you place it?
It's in my top 10 when you're playing with the expansion. Without the expansion, I would probably rank it somewhere roughly in my top 20. As far as I'm concerned, a human being needs only about three-ish worker placement games. Tribune, your favorite Uwe Rosenberg worker placement, and maybe something a little heavier if you're inclined. But you could probably get by with just 2. And I say this, this is true if your collection consists of 50 games or 500. That's about all you need.
Wow, you are a fan of worker placement, are you not?
I like worker placement just fine. It's just that many of them are kind of derivative and pointless. And given that Tribune does the genre really, really well, and I'll get into the reasons why later. And it brings a new take to the genre. I don't really think that you need a whole bunch of, the ones that don't really have much of a hook, as my partner Mike Walker from our podcast would say. Stone Age, Lords of Waterdeep, all that stuff. Like, they're fine, whatever, but they don't really stand out in a vast horde of middling Euro resource management things. And honestly, once you've played literally dozens of those kinds of designs, in many ways, those kinds of games repel me far more than something that's truly nightmarishly awful, like, say, your Twilight Imperiums or your First Martians. In some ways, to be bland and forgettable is the worst possible sin. And very often, worker placement is the solution for a designer who doesn't really have anything inspiring to do. They're just going to, shove something out generic. It's like, oh, okay, this is a way to balance different action selection. I'll just have it be a worker placement game.
Well, you've committed, so far, I can only count 8 deadly sins in that last statement. But the thing is, you made me very interested and it begged the question, what does this game do that all of those other games don't? Or what does it do that these games, or what does it do better, I should say?
Okay, so are we going to just skip past the sort of bland rules explanation thing that almost every board game critic does?
Oh, yes. The rules explanations bore me, please. You can briefly mention them. I'm more interested in opinions than of rules. If I want to learn the game, I'll watch a video or something. Sorry, go on.
Good man. I love you cyclopean Kurt Russell.
Thank you. Call me Snake.
So here's the deal. For one thing, one of the common failings of Euros, and worker placement is no exception, is they tend to be relatively light on player interaction. And indeed, just as worker placement is a sort of sloppy, lazy way to try to balance out action selection, it's often a sloppy, lazy way to introduce player interaction, because usually it's not particularly interactive. It's like, oh, I got there before you did. You're going to have to wait until next turn to get wood or whatever. So I can tell merely by the look on your face that you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is, even if you like worker placement games, I know you're a big fan of A Feast for Odin. I too am a big fan of A Feast for Odin. Not heavy on player interaction.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely agree with it. Okay.
Yeah. So
I was like bracing there. I was actually clenched and puckered. So I'm kind of weird. Like right now, it's going to take a while for the adrenaline to pump down. But keep going.
Sure. So the thing about Tribune is it's extremely confrontational in a standard Euro way, where you're not just punching each other in the face. It's not just, for one thing, the competition for resources on the board is far more pointed, because those resources are always oriented towards taking over control of a faction. So anytime anyone places to go claim a card, immediately, if you're paying attention to the game state, that sends off signals very much in the same way that a game like in Twilight Struggle, when someone takes over a country, you figure, why do they want that country? Where are they going next? And that immediately keys in for the different levels on which a confrontation can occur. And the most obvious, straightforward level of confrontation is indeed control over these factions. And that is, but it's not just the fact that people are placing to control factions, it's that they're placing to get the resources to get those factions. And so layered on top of all this are these intersecting goals that everybody has, and that naturally leads even the more pedestrian worker placement elements of the game to take on additional levels of player interaction and conflict in sometimes lots of subtle and sometimes lots of blunt ways. And so that's the first overall reason why I think Tribune really differentiates itself from other worker placement games, even the other ones that I really like.
Because at its core, what else is gaming but for a platform to interact with each other?
I disagree with that. I think that gaming can be lots of things to lots of different people, but I think that all things being equal, especially in a market oversaturated with multiplayer solitaire, a little bit of interplayer conflict and competition and direct interaction is often, although not always, for the good.
That's the last time I will ever give you an affirmative statement.
Wow.
Sorry about that.
Kaboom.
That's it.
No, I like the... Look, you're talking to somebody who spent a lot of the past couple of years re-exploring solitaire games. And there are lots of, as we've just discussed, there are lots of really good multiplayer solitaire games. I really like Feast for Odin. It's more or less multiplayer solitaire. only the thinnest veneer of interaction at the very tippity top.
Very much of worker placement type of interaction.
Exactly. And even then, it's having played the solo variant a couple times, it's like, oh yeah, this feels more or less like the base game. And
I mean, it's almost more interactive than the base game because it's like you're forced to kind of diversify in a way that you aren't necessarily unless people compete with you.
Absolutely. And that's I want to stop ragging on A Feast for Odin, but A Feast for Odin is that done well. When you strip out all the interesting stuff for A Feast for Odin, you're left with the sort of, again, the painfully generic pedestrian worker placement games that were really, they've kind of tapered off now, but it used to be the case that every other game was just a vanilla worker placement thing.
I think they've tapered off from established publishers, but when you look at like, a Kickstarter from a new company, a lot of times you're going to see that pedestrian worker placement, and that's where people are actually going to, jump in at that base level because they're looking, not so much for specifically a game that has an interesting mechanism as, oh, look at this neat artwork and it's about this. Oh, here's a game that's about this. And, what type of game is it? Worker placement. Everybody immediately is like, oh yeah, I've played, Lords of Waterdeep, the ones that you were mentioning. And it's just like, it's almost at that point, it's comforting and it's almost just by the motions. You're looking for a procedure. You're looking to move pieces around a board. And yeah, but I do think that, when it comes to capturing people's imagination and giving them a platform to, really crunch down into, I agree with you at that level.
I think worker placement now-ish, and especially a few years ago, is what auctions were about 10 to 15 years ago. Every other game was an auction game or lazily slapped on an auction to balance things out. Now it's worker placement. And this is not to deny the tremendous advancements that have been made in the field, right? Like early worker placement games, like Agricola, I still love Agricola, whatever, but it was always dominated by the ability to get more workers. And it took a few iterations of worker placement games to figure out, it's like, let's just get rid of that. Let's just strip it out and make it so that that's not an overwhelming dominant strategy. So I'm not to deny that the newer worker placement games haven't learned anything from the failures of the past, if you want to call it a failure, but it's a little overdone. It's a little oversaturated. Mm-hmm. And in that oversaturated market, Tribune still 10 years later stands out, if for no other reason than the first one, genuine player interaction on multiple different levels.
Absolutely. So it's a worker placement game, which is generally can be a multiplayer solitaire affair. And it actually, the other game systems that you have working with here are going to actually promote player interaction on a deeper level than what most worker placement games are able to achieve.
Precisely.
All right. So good thing we got that first question answered. Now, I'm
not done. I've got other stuff as to why it's great, though. But
oh, please go on. I want to hear greatness.
Okay. Despite the fact that it's heavy on player interaction, there's no king making. The way that takeovers work, there's no opportunity for A to weaken B so that C swoops in, and there's no reason why you'd punch A in the face just because they're winning. So despite the fact that it's heavy on that interaction, you don't tend to get the degenerate interaction that sometimes emerges. And one of the reasons why that's true is because there are genuinely multiple paths to victory. At the start of every game, you are given, you collectively at the table choose a scenario, and the scenario will list a certain number of objectives, and you're told in order to win, you need N of those objectives to win. So there's a list of 7 possible criteria, and you're told you need to get 3 to 5 of them. And they vary in intensity and difficulty. That having been said, based on the board state, based on what other players are doing, based on what cards you're given and what cards you might start with or draw, it makes more sense to pursue some rather than others, although it's still incumbent on you to be opportunistic and take advantage of whatever opportunities present themselves mid-game. As a result, it is not uncommon for the player who's in first place or the 2 people who are in contention for the win to be vying for radically different objectives, while at the same time running afoul of each other's plans. And that level of multivariate goals, nonetheless intersecting, can be fascinating from just watching the emergent game state. And despite all this, or rather, in part because of all this, you still have big turns. This is something you don't often see in Eurogames. Usually it's just making incremental progress here and there. I get $5, I get a couple of wood, what have you, and that's fine. I love those kinds of games. But one of the things that I sometimes envy about Ameritrash games, or I appreciate about them when I play, is sometimes you have the big tour de force turns where something massive happens. And Tribune kind of has that. When someone is able to pull off getting the eponymous Tribune victory condition, it requires them to have set up a number of different things across several different turns, usually, and make everything coalesce. And if you're able to do that, it's a big deal. It's very satisfying. It's a momentous thing to happen. And so it's a game that has a sense of drama to some of the consequences. Again, by the scale of Eurogames, I'm not going to pretend like it's some sort of massive mic drop, screaming, running around the table moment. Well, that's how I do it, but other people can do it differently. It's nonetheless, it's the case that you can make big, substantial achievements because there are these single high-value objectives. Now, you can also, if you want, go grub for money or get the 12 laurels or what have you and do the incremental ones. But some of them require big moves, and that's great. And all of this in a game that experienced players will reliably knock out under an hour. This game, and this is one of the chief virtues, but I didn't want to list it first because I don't want to make it sound as this is the...
Uh-oh. TC, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. What's up?
Mark,
sorry.
I lost you at... I don't want to make this sound like...
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. My apologies. I'm doing my best to manage technology here, but...
No, it's fine. It sounded like you just kind of had a little hiccup or something. So I don't want to... Whatever I just said, it's already out of my head.
Sorry.
But that's where the audio kind of cut. Did it the same thing happen to PC?
I heard everything just fine. I didn't even.
I'm sorry. It must have been on my end. I apologize, Mark. I apologize.
Okay, well, I'll start again, and you can edit it together seamlessly. Okay.
Yes. Thanks, TC.
Yes.
So one of its chief virtues, and I didn't want to mention this first because I didn't want to make it sound as though this is one of the key draws or the only reason why it's great, is that you get all this. You get all this sense of drama, you get this competition, you get this head-to-head fighting and the multiple paths to victory in a game that is quick, quick, quick. This is a tight game. It lasts about 4 to 6 rounds tops. It's always faster than people expected, usually in a satisfying way. And, 45 to 60 minutes with experienced players, despite the fact that this is as meaty and as satisfying and has as much of an arc as almost any other worker placement you're going to find. And it's all those things together that makes it, in my estimation, still the undisputed king of a very crowded genre.
Whoa! Wow, those are bold words.
They certainly are. And it really, let's bring it back here and let's talk about nuts and bolts now. So I think now that you've kind of given an idea of what's the draw, let's do just a little bit of an idea. Like we've got worker placement. We've talked about that. And you've mentioned that the early draw of many worker placement games, or the early dominant strategy, was just acquiring more workers. Now in Tribune, you have set amount and you just have them. Am I remembering this correctly, or is there a way to achieve more workers?
There is a single faction, control of which grants you an additional worker.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's a different colored one too. It's like
it's the proconsul. Yeah, it's the blue guy. He rides around in the chariot until someone claims him, and then he goes and helps you. It is usually the case, though, that by the time the extra worker, by the time it's used, usually what you get is good and certainly worth having, but I wouldn't call it dominant by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh yeah, you're getting like the last action in the round, and really like this board is going to be picked to the point where there's going to be spots just by virtue of what you are actually doing when you take these workers. Your best spots are going to definitely be prioritized, and really like most cards are going to be useful to most people. So I mean, let's then talk about, so with the worker placement, what you're doing is you're placing a worker to take an action. There are 2 different sort of main areas to place. Let's go over the one with more spots, the one that's kind of more the resources in the game.
Sure. Well, there are actually 3 different places, strictly speaking. The main area of the board consists of what would normally be considered the sort of core action spaces. Here is where you're going to be sending workers, usually, though not exclusively, to get cards. There are 8 spaces just to buy cards, and it's simply a question of 2 of them cost $1 each, and then 6 of them cost $3 each. Those are reasonably straightforward. There's a couple other ways to get cards that are a little bit more tricky that are about Hail Mary shots, because what you want isn't on the board or was taken by somebody else. So you go fishing for some hidden set of cards. There's also an auction.
Nobody will get to see this before, like nobody knows that you have this card. So that hidden information, but like you said, it's a Hail Mary shot. Many of those are not just like you get the card here. Some of them have like, the first person to take the action gets to see all of the cards and choose one, right?
Yes, you're talking specifically about the catacombs, and the way it works there is there are 3 available spots, one for $4, one for $3, one for $2. You can place wherever you damn well please, and basically whoever has volunteered to pay the most picks up a stack of 5 face-down cards and has the option of buying one of their choice. They then pass it down to the next person who is at the lower level of the economy, and so on and so forth. This actually interacts subtly with control of one of the factions. One of the factions, as their faction bonus, can take all the money that has been accumulating on the catacombs to pay for those cards. And so sometimes it's more to their advantage, the person who's controlling that faction, to just go to the catacombs and fish there. So again, sometimes none of these bottom actions exist in a vacuum, and they all interact with all the other elements that are going on in the game. And then there are a couple of other action spots that aren't about card manipulation at all, but are purely about pursuing some of the other victory conditions. One of them, you peek at a face-down card, and if later on you're able to discard a card of that suit, you get a victory condition, which is called Favor of the Gods, or Besties Forever. And but in order to go there, you need to have already controlled one of the factions. And then finally, the last place is just chuck a pair of cards to get some laurels, and laurels are just sort of they're arguably the least interesting of the victory condition. You just acquire laurels, sometimes by accident, but if you need to make a push for laurels, you go visit this last action space and start ditching cards for extra laurels.
Well, lets you do something with cards that you may have fished and came up, dry, came up with a card.
Absolutely. Or indeed, a faction that you thought you were going to make a push for, but the board state changes and you either don't need the faction anymore, or it's become the case that you're never going to be able to get it in time. And so indeed, you're right. One of the you need to remain flexible, and just because you acquired a card for one purpose doesn't mean that you should remain locked into the view of using it for that purpose.
Yeah, it kind of serves as a bit of an outlet in dire need, in dire times, but definitely not something that you're going to start the game thinking, how do I get the most cards efficiently so that I can go ditch them for laurels? I'd say that, like you mentioned, this is by far the most vanilla element of the game, and it almost works as a game clock as opposed to really a strategy to pursue.
Well, it depends. I disagree. It really depends on which faction objectives you're pursuing. If it's the case that over the course of the game, either deliberately or because you felt that the game was pressuring you to do that, you have gone after the factions that reward you more heavily with laurels, like the Vestal Virgins, like the Legates, can very well be in your interest about halfway through the game to look at to try to figure out which victory conditions you're going to make a push for, and say, hey, I'm close to the threshold of getting the laurels. I should go make a push for the remaining ones. And you might even go seek out cards expressly for that purpose. So I disagree that it's be a release valve for trash. Sometimes it will be, depending on what you're going for, but sometimes it's the way you're going to make a push for that last victory condition. Okay,
yeah, fair enough. So you were considering all that part of the first of 3 worker placement spots.
Yes.
Worker placement
the second spot is the coin bowl. You just send people there for money. And I'm going to have a little bit more to say about that when we talk about the expansion. And the third spot is where a lot of the consequences happen. That's where the faction takeovers get placed. One of the things you mentioned, Joe, is that you felt, this is in private correspondence, viewers, so this is kind of a peek inside the kimono. That's a broadcasting.
I made such a mistake by giving him anything to go off of, and now we're going to hear about it.
Yeah. No, you raised a very interesting question. You said, look, isn't this basically just a card draft? What additional virtue, what benefit do we get out of this being a more fleshed out worker placement system? And the answer is this. First of all, I'd say that most of the time worker placement is just a variation on a draft anyway. But in this case, what makes it really sing and what amps up the tension is precisely the fact that if you are going to make a play for a faction, if you're going to make a takeover attempt, number one, you do so publicly. And number two, the sooner you do it, the better off you are. So at the same time that people are competing for the resources to take over factions, they're also committing to take over factions. So not infrequently, it is the case that two players want to make a play for the same faction. A whole bunch of cards, or some number of cards, that could be 0 to 5 or whatever, cards come up for that faction, and then you start thinking, okay, when do I pull the trigger? Because my placing to take over a faction not only broadcasts my intentions, but costs me tempo in snapping up those resources. Will I be able to get enough resources in time? How many cards are they sitting on? How many cards am I sitting on? How many more do I need? And two people can make a play for a faction the same turn, but whoever commits second does so at a disadvantage. And so this tension, this element of the race, all happening publicly, is sometimes captured in a draft, but this additional level of tension of both acquiring the resources and committing to use them is, I think, made much more plausible and tense through a worker placement system.
Certainly, yeah. You've got, as opposed to where in a draft where everything is private and nothing is really publicly revealed, you could be competing for something and have no idea who's competing with you. And in that case, you just kind of are, kind of feeling your way through the dark. Whereas here, you've got some dim lights shining in certain areas, and especially regarding what you just mentioned, where if you're going to fight for a faction, there's another person who could fight with you, but if you can get that first spot, then you've got the advantage winning that faction over. I do see where you're coming here from with the increased tension and the fact that you're able to, sort of see where you're at and, maybe sacrifice the tempo on the first worker placement we've talked about to go up to kind of the second major worker placement aspect. The third, of course, being the coin bowl, which we're not going to discuss at this moment.
Yeah, it's even if the draft were face up, if it were a face up draft where everyone could see all the cards available and I could see where you're snatching, you still wouldn't get that tempo, that issue of when do I blink and commit to taking over the faction. Because most of the time in draft games, whether it's a private draft or a public draft, you draft all your cards and then you use them later in some rough simultaneity or a relatively crude player order. But given that you're making these commitments to play the cards at the same time you're getting them, knowing when you have to do that, when you should call it off, wait till next turn, or when you think you can go head-to-head, take that second spot and make a play for the faction even at the disadvantage, those kinds of decisions really amp up the tension and really help with help make the player interaction sing and help make the worker placement really come into its own.
Certainly. So not every card that you're getting is going to cost the same amount. Not every card is going to be necessarily visible, but there is enough that is left open information so that you can really, at least what publicly publicly available tools there are at your disposal and what you can do with them. Absolutely. So in terms of the two different areas, we've got get cards and then use cards, right? I mean, you can use cards like we've mentioned for Loyals, but I think that we've discussed that area. The other main way to use cards, could you just go into how that specific area of the board, how that part of the game is resolved?
Sure. If I put a worker under the senators, for example, what I'm doing is I'm saying that later on, after all the workers have been placed, I'm going to commit to play a set of senator cards. And so all the cards are suited based on these 7 factions. And I'm just saying that I'm going to be able to play a set of senators that is better than the set of senators of the player currently controlling them. And it can be better either because it has more cards or has a higher total value. And that lack of transitivity I find really interesting. Set A can beat set B, and set B beats set C, but maybe set A doesn't beat set C. That's a weird element of interaction that I actually quite like, especially when multiple players are vying for the same faction. Timing everything can become crucial. And when it's my turn to play, the person controlling the faction just has to sit there and take it in the face. And if I'm able to play a better set, then I've got the senators now, and I'm going to hold it as long as and until someone else comes and takes it from me. And that is probably the key, as you say, the key virtue of having cards. That is their key function, but by no means the only one.
So how is it that a set A can beat a set C while A beats B and B beats C? What
is this algebra
set?
Something like that.
Okay.
Let's say that my set is of 5 cards and your set is of 4 cards. Then my set beats yours. But if your set of 4 cards is of higher value than C's set of 5 cards, it beats C. But my set of 5 cards won't necessarily beat C's set of 5 cards. Have I made myself appropriately obscure?
Absolutely, yes, because there's 2 different qualities you need to evaluate here. Just the sole number of cards will be, a greater quantity of cards will beat a better quality of cards, essentially, and vice versa.
Yes, exactly. And so it is possible for your quantity to go beat quality, but that quality beat quantity previously. And
so they can really kind of go back and forth. It's not just a march towards a higher number. It is, but it's kind of, there's ways that you can kind of shimmy back and forth depending on what specific you're going for, right?
Yes. That also feeds into 2 other things. Number 1, there are limited abilities to mess with other people's sets of cards. There's the ability to assassinate people, which basically just strips a card from a set that's already been played. But more saliently, it's actually a significant element of timing, strategy, and player preference as to when you take over a faction. I tend to take over factions as soon as I possibly can, so the sets tend to be relatively weak. But a lot of other people would rather wait a turn and take over a faction with a massive set of cards, knowing that they can sit there and hold on to that faction for several turns in a row. And there's no better or worse way to do it. It's a question of what you want out of that faction, and whether you plan on sitting there for a while or if you just want them transactionally for some short-term game.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the factions are not only going to give you victory conditions towards many different paths, as you said, different viable paths to victory, but they're also going to give you faction powers.
Yes.
So, I mean, like, where do you find is the best balance, right? Are you generally considering the power or the victory condition when you're trying to build a set? When you first make that decision, like looking at the board state, what do you think stronger, or what, is each faction power, kind of situationally going to give you an advantage?
I tend, and this is more about me as a gamer than the design itself, I tend to be very, very opportunistic and focus on short-term gains. And so I look at the factions which will give me quick return on whatever takeover bonus that I plan on getting. This tends to feature for factions like the Vestals, sometimes the Gladiators. If I'm able to get the leader, they'll be able to give me a windfall of legions. This is sometimes the Senators. Anyway, it really depends, but there are some other
bit more holistic in general. Like, holistically, you're looking at what could give you the best advantage that could then be used to get another advantage maybe later, and not necessarily, here I am going to corner the market on this.
Yes, it is. But that having been said, I've seen lots of other successful players take a more deliberative approach and instead say, okay, first what I'm going to do, or at least first what I'm going to conceptualize, is take over a faction with a massive stack and then build the rest of my strategy around them. Rather than making the faction powers work to my strategy, I'm going to make my strategy work to the faction power. And that, as I say, that's just not the way that I play. But I can tell you that when you're playing against players who are doing this effectively, it can be very frustrating to look over and say, especially if you're like me and you want to remain reactive, and I think, okay, now it would benefit me to take over the legates quickly. But then I look over and I see that the person who took over the legates 2 turns ago has a massive stack and no one's going to be able to touch them unless I change my approach and try to commit to something which is contrary to my interest, or I just let them keep it, in which case I have to go look elsewhere.
Wow. Yeah. So you've given a great idea of what type of strategy you approach, as well as what you've seen with successful ways to go about this. What are there's only 6 factions in the game, if I'm remembering correctly.
No, there are 7.
6 plus 1. That's what I meant. It must have been the internet connection. You must not have heard that. 6 plus 1.
I'm terribly sorry. Canadian internet. It must be the metric system up here.
Oh yeah,
it's algebra. It's algebra.
Of course, man. Yeah, I love Fahrenheit too. Yes. Do not ever try to make me change. So seven factions. I'm sorry here. I don't know why, but I feel like there was 6 victory conditions maybe on the cards. Maybe that was like because when you draw a card, is there like when you play the different sort of the game types? I feel like there was 6 bars. I don't know. Maybe I'm totally dreaming this up. Maybe it's 7. But anyway, I feel like it was recently that I looked, but I'm also, certifiably insane. So that's your fault for agreeing to do this, Mark.
Let's not mental illness shame, Joe. No, you're right. There are 6 different victory conditions in the base game.
Okay. All right.
If I said 7, I'm sorry. I apologize. We regret the error.
I forgive you. Oh, beat you to it.
Oh, that's very good of you.
Right. Sniped that. So,
I'm not editing that out, by the way.
Of those 7 different faction abilities, could you kind of walk me through each one and its usefulness?
Sure. So there's 2 things to keep in mind. And again, this relates back to this issue of tempo that I was talking about, whether you want them for the long haul or whether you just want them for a quick pump and dump. There's the takeover benefit. That's the benefit you get immediately when you grab them. And then there's the benefit they're going to give you every turn that you control them. And sometimes you want them for one, and sometimes you want them for the other. And so, briefly speaking, I'll focus more on the powers that you have while you hold on to them. The gladiators are a great source of income because they give you all the money from, as I said, the catacombs, or they give you a small amount of card power and the ability to assassinate. So the gladiators are just mostly about income of one form or another, and they're reasonably flexible. The legates, which are basically lawyers or representatives, the legates are very cool because they're one of the only 2 factions that can give you a scroll being a prerequisite for becoming the eponymous tribune.
Yes, scrolls can be. Yeah, it really is like the gigantic club your way to the win. It's a huge shooting the moon style victory. I would equate it to shooting the moon in trick-taking game.
That is absolutely right. And that relates to what I said before when there can be big moments in Tribune. If somebody gets Tribune, that is indeed one of those big plays that you need to pull off. But in order to even contemplate it, first you need a scroll. They can also give you the ability to buy legions, and there's an interesting tension there. Legions are another victory condition. You can buy legions if you control the legates, but basically, to put it simply, the weaker your control of the legates are, the cheaper it is to buy legions. The better your legate set is, the more talented your administrators, the more expensive it is to buy legions. So again, there's a tension there. Do you want to sit on the legates for a while, or do you want to play it risky?
But you're limited to how many you can buy in a turn, right?
You can just buy the one legion at a turn.
Yeah,
from the legates.
Yeah. So I mean, like you get it cheaper, but now you have this tenuous grasp on the legates, and you're probably not going to be able to do that much.
If I want the legates for legions, I have to know that a lot of other people probably want the legates for the scroll. That dovetails with what I was talking about, how there are multiple paths to victory, and sometimes those different paths intersect in surprising player interaction ways, even if we're pursuing different objectives for different reasons. The legates are one of those focal points in precisely that way. But they're not the only way to get legions. The gladiators get you legions as you take over the gladiators. The Praetorians give you a legion every turn. The patricians are the ones who give you that proconsul figure that I told you about, the little blue guy. He's your extra worker. I will say that, especially amongst new players, a solid majority of the time, all they use that extra worker for is to get money so that they can keep that extra worker. It becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. More power to you. Then there are the filthy plebs. The plebeians give you a little bit of card and money income, or, and this is where things get a little bit intricate, if you already have a scroll, and on the same turn you control both the plebeians and the patricians, then the plebeians will make you tribune. So you need to have already acquired the scroll and controlled both the lower classes and the upper classes at the same time. And that can be super tricky, but it can be worth it. The Vestal Virgins, who represent basically the only religious caste in the game, similarly will give you tribune if you control them and the senators at the same time, and you already have a scroll. So there are 2 ways to get there, but they both require 2 factions at a time. The Vestals are also the gatekeepers for another victory condition, which is favor of the gods. in a relatively convoluted way. If you already control them, that grants you access to a new part of the board. There's an action space on the board that you can only go to if at one point you've controlled the Vestals. And
yeah, you get like there's like a certain token that even represents like you've been to the Vestals or not.
Yes. Whenever you take control of a faction, you get a faction control marker.
Yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things about the resources in Tribune, despite the fact that it's very confrontational and people are taking control of things left, right, and center. You don't lose anything in this game other than cards and money. Once you've won something, it's yours forever, and nobody can take it from you. So there's no possibility of having...
There's no take that.
Exactly, and nobody's
There's take that over, but there's no take that.
Yes, and as a result, there will be a constant march towards victory. That's one of the reasons why the game doesn't have the possibility of dragging. It's just unless people are playing completely randomly, you're just amassing these resources, and it's just a question of which ones get to the breakpoint first.
So it really does move towards a crescendo.
Absolutely.
So each of those different 7 faction abilities that we've talked about are intricately tied to the victory conditions, which exist in every single game regardless. Plus, you've got you're different depending on what scenario you play as. Or was there another name besides scenario? Am I missing?
I think in the rules they just call it a victory card, but I call them scenarios. They're effectively just different weightings of the different victory conditions. And indeed, in some of them, some of the victory conditions are mandatory. So a common one for a longer scenario, and these are the ones that might last longer than 60 minutes, but probably at the most no longer than 90, especially if you're playing with experienced players. Some of them have Tribune be a mandatory victory condition. So in order to win, Tribune has got to be one of the things you've done. And those ones are serious knife fights, because everybody knows that everybody needs it. And the moment somebody controls one of the 2 factions that are needed, everyone tries to make sure that they can't get the second one. And that is an area where when you're able to pull that off, that is a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, and when Tribune is an absolute victory condition, it becomes a whole different ball game. Like you're not like worrying, like when you first see somebody going for it, you're like, they wouldn't dare. But when Tribune when Tribune must happen, though, at that point it becomes like we're gonna swat this, we're gonna nip this one in the bud.
Yep, yeah. As said before, the different paths to victory cause different player interactions on different levels. But when Tribune is a mandatory victory condition, you know that everyone needs to get to that specific end goal, and that increases the directness of the player interaction and the direct competition over specific things.
Yeah, absolutely an excellent description there. Of all those different faction powers, how they relate to those, it's awesome. So, what do you prefer in the end game goals? What are you looking for? I mean, do you have different place and times for each one? Do you just play them all? Do you shuffle them and choose your favorite? Because to me, they seem really like the game is like these different victory conditions are kind of almost more towards like, I feel like I could see myself preferring one or preferring one in a certain situation and not necessarily just leaving it to chance and drawing a random victory card.
It depends on, again, it depends a lot on playstyle. Speaking again, personally, being a very opportunistic short-term player, especially when it comes to something like Tribune, I look at my starting hand and I figure, okay, what can I do with this? Does this starting hand allow me to quickly grab a faction or ideally 2? Of course, my starting hand in conjunction with the starting board position. Will I be able to grab something quickly? Will that allow me to make salient progress towards 1 or 2 of the victory conditions? Okay, fine. Then after I've done that, after I've gotten my first steps, I then start to look at what other people have already committed to and find the path of least resistance for whatever is left. And if somebody gives me strong opposition for my initial push towards a couple of victory conditions, well, then I'll just have to find pastures elsewhere. But to make a push for Tribune right off the top. I've played with people who do that, and it's an admirable policy because that's well, it's a bold way to play.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's kind of like playing with your cards face up.
Yeah, it's definitely it's definitely a boss move, and if you can pull it off, then that's great. But I don't like to commit myself too much right off the bat.
Or is it low-hanging fruit?
Sometimes it is, and if it is the case that sometimes Tribune being so difficult becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, everyone thinks it's so difficult, so nobody bothers to make a strong push for it. And by the time in turn, 2 or 3, and someone's cinched up Tribune and a victory condition besides, and everyone looks around and realizes it's too late, and they did the nominally hard thing when it was easy, then that can definitely be profitable. And if you've got the cards to pull it off, then Godspeed. But as I say, I tend to try to remain flexible. This is obviously in scenarios where there's no required victory condition. If there's a required victory condition, well, then obviously that is the first priority, at least knowing where theoretically that can come from. But again, that's just on my personal preference and my personal play style. As I say, I've seen different people approach it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, direction-wise, I think that you can, go towards any sorts of them. I was leaning towards, like if somebody's getting started, like let's say that you've never played Tribune before and you're going to be teaching a game full of people. Would you recommend people to read through each and every victory condition and consider each one, or would you point towards one to sort of ease them into the experience?
I would tell them to look at what cards they have in their initial hand, grab those factions that they have cards in, and then look at their holdings and say, what are the nearest victory conditions I have? And then start making a play for those. Because it is often the case in this game that you spend the first couple rounds or even the first 3 rounds where no one has achieved any of the victory conditions. And then the last round, suddenly they start falling like flies. Everyone's getting them one after the other, because it is the case that, if in a standard victory condition game, you need like 8 laurels and 3 legions, well, it might take you a little bit to get there, but once you get there, you start getting all of the victory conditions all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be the case that while pursuing a goal for some other purpose, you find yourself with a legion or 2, and then you figure, oh, okay, I could get a 3rd.
Yeah, well, and people will generally allow you those incremental advancements as opposed to one big sweeping Tribune turn.
Yeah, exactly. It's and if you're careful and you bide your time as a new player and you just try to play to your card strengths and figure out where to get those last marginal resources near the end, you can definitely make a stronger showing, I think, than if an experienced player at the table gives you the bad advice at pointing at one of the victory conditions and saying, yeah, this one's easy, go for this one. Because that I think I've seen people give advice like that in other games. I used to joke that there was a guy I played with at MIT back when I lived in Boston all the time, and no matter what the game was, he would always say at the end of the rules explanations, like, X is the way to win. Doesn't matter what the game was, he would always have his opinion on there's this one
Give you
thing.
the meta. Just start the meta here. You start it, guide it yourself, and you'll be able to appreciate it that way.
Exactly. And, for what it's worth, sometimes he was right. Like, after a rules explanation of St. Petersburg, he'd lean over and say, by the way, the nobles bonus is the way to go. And, I agree with him on that one.
That's true. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But sometimes he would, play a game like, if he were playing a game like Feast for Odin, I never played that with him, but he might lean over and say something along the lines of, whaling is the only way to go. And it's like, no, dude, you just like to whale, and that's fine. Don't tell this new player that that's the only way the game works.
If he had said that emigration is the only way to go, this is a topic for a different podcast. I'm already intrigued. All right, so you're going to be on for the next Feast for Odin episode when we have it.
Oh, you better.
Yeah. So, I totally agree that there is a certain amount of direction that you're going to get just from, because you do start with a certain amount of cards in your hand that are hidden from other players, and these are going to be good strategies to stick to, because that way you're not just getting cards based on what's out, because when people see you doing things, they've already got their own strategies formulated. If they see you do things, it starts to make them wonder, like, I wonder what cards he's holding on to, really start to evaluate their own strategy. So they're going to assume that you have some higher cards, and maybe they're going to compete with you over the factions, which those factions are not just I go there, I get the faction this turn. You have competition built into the system, but a limited amount of competition. It's fascinating because you've got two people that can compete for each faction. Now, it's not going to be two people competing for each faction in a given turn, because many times, one person is going to go there and the next, like every other player is going to just basically, say, all right, we concede that and we're going to try, get it from you maybe next turn, wrest control back from of that faction. But you've got two spots open. And as you mentioned, the first player to go there sacrifices tempo, but gains the advantage. What did you mean by that? And what do you think that this only like two slotted auction does for this game?
I think that what it does is it gives greater degree of flexibility, and it adds to this texture of different people needing the same thing for different reasons. Here's why. If I need the Vestal Virgins, let me rephrase that. If I need to control a certain faction, out of context, that could have been bad, then sometimes...
Thanks for doing that. You did that yourself.
No problem. Sometimes I need the faction right away. Sometimes I need the takeover bonus right away, or sometimes I need to control them for several turns. Other times, I just need them sooner or later. And I don't care if it's this round or next round. Usually, the game is so short that looking past 3 rounds from now is usually fatal. But if it's an early round, sometimes you have some time to be magnanimous and figure, not this time, I'll get him next time. But in cases, but then there are those other cases where it's not even so much that I need them this round. It's that I can't let you have them this round. I can't let you get them now. And that's where sometimes it is absolutely worth it to go in that second slot, either because, number one, you think you've got the cards to pull it off, and I'll talk about the advantage in just a second, but number one, you either think you have the cards to pull it off, or number two, you are willing to spend the rest of your turn fishing to try to find the hidden cards to outgun your opponent. And when that works, it is beautiful, and is indeed one of those big moments like getting Tribune, when the number 2 player is able to lay out their set and look over at the number 1 player and say, so what do you got? And if they send the number 1 player packing, it can be very, very satisfying. The advantage that the number 1 player has is that, as we mentioned before, set A can beat set B, and set B can beat set C, but sometimes set A can't beat set C. One of the reasons why that's the case is because there's kind of an attacker advantage, because there's 2 ways that sets can be better, and as the quote-unquote attacker, you get to pick the way in which your set is better. So if you place your worker second to take over a faction, you have to play your set first, and your set has to be good enough to win. But then the player who placed first can show up later and say, well, my set's better than yours. And if you fail, not only have you lost the worker, but you also lose a card from your set, which further makes it more difficult, though by no means impossible, to remount your offensive next round. So long story short, it's exactly as you say. It's a question of, am I willing to sacrifice the tempo, or do I think I have the necessary cards, or do I think I'm going to get the necessary cards to just outgun you to the point where you can't contest me?
Absolutely. Yeah, you really said it there. I mean, the attacker getting to choose which of those 2 ways gives them a distinct advantage, but the defender can still outgun them in a way that can feel quite like just dessert. So remind me here, is it one of those things where the attacker or the losing player in this sort of, bitter struggle, are they losing these cards, or are they just taking them back and able to then play them later?
They lose a single card, and it's a single card of their choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly the card hurts. It's also the placement, and you also know that this thing that they wanted for this round, for whatever reason, they're not going to get. And sometimes it's indeed a miscalculation on either player's part, because you weren't paying attention and you didn't see that the other player has been amassing these cards for round on round on round. And again, that's one of the difficulties that I often have, because I view things in such a short-term opportunistic way. I sometimes just ignore the fact that somebody has been amassing senators all game for that big final push to blow everyone else out, because they knew that they could afford to wait. Because my natural thinking for me is, well, if I've got some senators, I'm going to make a push for them right away, instead of saying, oh, I've got some senators, I can wait and make sure that by the time I make my move, nobody can possibly contest me. And
yeah, again, what you've already done is you've already poisoned our entire audience to thinking that 3 turns in advance could be fatal, which is your form of being this MIT guy you've talked about, developing your own meta. Self-fulfilling, sir.
It's not so much about the horizon of the game. It's more about how long the game itself lasts. And a game typically lasts about 4 to 6 rounds, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, especially when it gets down to
I'm sorry.
The ability where you can just make the game sing. It sounds to me like you've just gotten it played so many times where you can see the bare, what's underneath the mechanics, and actually be excited because that involves such a level of interaction that you can never quite anticipate everything that your other players are doing. The game has a level of opacity, which I know is a big buzzword right now being thrown on especially heavy game circles, that does help to fuel what's an easy, otherwise easy to fairly, I would say, easy to understand and grasp. It's not rocket science here. You're building sets by, you're taking these actions. As I said, this is worker placement to get cards. But because it's all tied to like this sort of end of the round pissing match, you are absolutely in tune and want to know what cards your opponents are going for and want to use that, because you're all going to eventually need, it has that level of Agricola where it's like you're going to kind of need most of these victory conditions at some point, or at least that's the holistic approach to take the game. But then there's these other sort of like you've mentioned, like opportunistic side goals or one big swoop. I've amassed it all and I've taken it all in one swoop and emerged victorious as the Tribune. So I can definitely see why the auction needing competition, not auction. I want to say it's barely an auction. It's like, you've got to wrest control and now you're the one that's in charge, but you need the ability to see some competition. But, I can also see why the system is built where there's only space for one person to compete.
Yeah, in many ways, the truly successful player will, by the time people are competing to take stuff from them, they've already moved on. They've already taken what they've needed, and they're on to the next goal. They're on to the next thing. And a lot of that is tempo, and a lot of that is just anticipating what the needs are and just being one step ahead of all your opponents. So I agree with your characterization. I agree with you also that it's not really much of an auction. I think it's actually, having considered the matter, I think it's a bizarre sort of mini climbing game where there's only one climb to make, because it's very much about I've laid out this set that follows it and is indeed better. So if you want to call that an auction, fine. I don't necessarily feel the need to shoehorn it that way.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I guess I don't have like the. I was never beat over the head by an auction like you guys were back before 2007. So, this is something that to me, like auctions at this point, there's enough gems that have continued on as like evergreen games, especially from the great Doctor himself, that, to me, like including something as an auction or comparing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting there are auctions in Tribune, just as a minor side note. And sometimes, again, it's one of those instances where one of the auctions is over cards, and it's just a simple closed fist, winner pays the loser bid. Sometimes people show up there because they desperately need the cards. Sometimes people show up there because they desperately need the money. And it's that level of interaction. Some people are pursuing different goals, but they find themselves in the same place. And sometimes, if the other person's just there for money, you can lowball them and send them home very, very disappointed and walk away with some great cards. Or if you miscalculate, sometimes someone else might end up with a fistful of cheap cards. It's one of those ways that the different paths intersect in a beautiful, beautiful way.
Very intriguing. And yeah, I would say that you've painted the picture here for how this game has carved out its own niche that has continued for you into it's lasted more than a decade now, while you've been playing all of the new hotness and even got to the point where you tell me that multiplayer, you use the phrase multiplayer solitaire and then say you like the game, which is a new step. I was very surprised you when you first brought up Feast for Odin, but I can see why this game has continued to impress you and your group with its interaction. Now, what about the expansion? Because we've talked just about the base game so far, and you've said that you really love this game with that caveat. What's the caveat there for? Why is this top 10 only with the expansion? What all does it add? What all does it add, and why does it make it such a top 10 game for you?
The caveat is as follows. In the base game, all of the victory cards have as a possible victory condition money, a certain quantity of money that you need to acquire. And the way, the fastest, easiest, most obvious route to get money in the base game is just dump a whole bunch of workers in the coin bowl. And there's no player interaction there. There's no race. There's no tension. It's just, okay, I've got my N-1 victory conditions. The last one might as well be money. I've got these 4 workers. That'll get me $20. That's enough to get me there. Done. Bang, bang, bang. It's not an interesting end. It's not an interesting goal, and it doesn't interact with the other players very neatly at all. So it is sometimes the case that you end up with somewhat anticlimactic endings in a disappointing rush just to get cash because, again, there's no interaction there. In the expansion, they introduce a whole bunch of other victory conditions, and all of the victory cards, all the scenarios in the expansion, do not have money as a goal to win the game. And so money is relegated to its normal role, which is just a means to an end, where that end is usually cards or other assets. So that's the chief benefit of playing with the expansion. And right there is one of the main reasons why I, whenever possible, want to play with it. Now, that having been said, you're quite right in observing that every individual piece in Tribune is very straightforward and easy to grok. However, new players tend to get overwhelmed with the number of factions and the number of faction benefits. Even though it's mostly just a sideshow and a means to an end, they start getting confused about different powers and so forth. The turn structure is also a little bit counterintuitive at times. And once you add in the expansion, I have taught new players who are new to the game, the base game and the expansion in one sitting, but that is a Herculean feat of both explanation and comprehension. And so I do it very, very rarely for only very, very select groups of people. And then often I end up regretting the decision. So you have to play with the base game first, usually, and even then there might be a couple of minor corner cases that are difficult for them to grasp, and then move on to the expansion, because it's just a whole bunch of extra places to put workers, a whole bunch of extra victory conditions, and it's just, a lot. And once you play the game a couple times, it's no great strain, but right off the bat, it's tricky. And that's even before one considers the absolute lunacy, the incredible weirdness that is the extra faction, which is the Broodii.
Yeah, that's what I was really going to bring up. You hadn't even mentioned that. You've got asymmetry all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's weird. Basically, the way I would explain it, and this is for an American audience, so I assume that all of you are currently armed at the moment. If in a normal game you've got a room full of cards and you're just shooting them with a pistol, playing as the Broodii player is like walking into a room full of cards and suddenly you're blindfolded, but you have a shotgun. You're going to hit a whole bunch of stuff, but you don't necessarily know what it's going to be at the outset. It's not random. It's just hard to control. It's also another great analogy, which would probably work less well for an American audience because it doesn't involve firearms, is it's like drinking out of a fire hose. There's a lot going on and it's very strong, but it's not necessarily directed in the way that you want it to all the time. So instead of placing workers, the Broodii player has 3 opportunities during a round to play a card, a special card of their own deck. And these cards are madness. They're basically forms of, just to oversimplify the matter, many of the cards take the form of, at the end of the round, take everything that people didn't want. And so you end up with this vast influx of trash and detritus. But it's a huge quantity. And so the challenge of playing the Broodii is accommodating this, trying to read what's going to be available, but it's very difficult. And then making do with this huge hand of nonsense. And it's also the case that taking over factions as the Broodii is really hard, because when you play the takeover card, you either get to, number 1, take over all the factions that nobody else is trying to take over this turn, or be in the number 2 slot of all the factions where someone else is trying to take over the faction this turn. Again, massive action potential, but not a whole heck of a lot of control. I haven't played as the Broodii player nearly as much as I would like to. That is probably my experience of which I have the least, because again, it's that extra level of complexity. First, you have to explain the base game. Then everyone has to understand the expansion. And then somebody at the table needs to forget how to place workers and needs to deal with these nonsense cards that they're dealt with. It's like, this action card does what now? It's like, well, it does the following 12 disadvantageous things, but all of them at the same time. And so it's just, usually it's a bridge too far. when I've played it, it's always been with experienced players, and it's usually just good for a wild ride. So I can't really comment on how balanced it is or how rigorous it is. I have the utmost respect for Karl-Heinz Schmiel, so I assume this was playtested to the nth degree. It's just not something I have a whole lot of experience.
I am intrigued.
You found the TCPs. That describes it in a very interesting way. I never did try playing with it, even back when I used to own the expansion, which I no longer own. But what you've said about the other elements do make me kind of rue the day that I decided that it had been out of print and I'm not getting the base game played, because what you've mentioned about the coin bowl becoming more of a focal point does sound quite interesting.
It's also it's also a game where you get to liberate slaves, and anytime you get to do that in the game, I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm. It's all these points that you've brought up so far, Mark, have really helped me, reinvigorate me to bring this one back to the table, because, really at the core, what I experienced in my first game or two of playing this was what you've talked about. It was just that I don't know that it fits. My group is very chock full of millennials that are not comfortable with anything beyond multiplayer solitaire, like you said. And it's okay. We've what we've been doing as we've been going is kind of, shedding them like yesterday, like last year's skin cells. So I don't know. I'm not going to make any more references like that. I'm not going to let myself do that. So anyway, the thing is, I played this with a group of people that were not comfortable with the level of interaction that it had. Now, knowing now what you've said, I'm very intrigued to try it again. There's one other sort of point of interest here to talk about, and that is that this is a worker placement game that resolves in a specific order, right? Yes. So it is along the lines, I think, the heaviest worker placement games out there either force players in competition, and I don't want to say heavy, but the most tense games force players in competition for the same eventual things. Now, this Tribune, as you've mentioned, can do that, basically does that. You're going to be seeing the victory. Victory in here is not like a how many points did you get? Oh, I only got this many. Victory here is a I won. And you're going to know what victory conditions people have met. The other way that you can really force players in to be at each other's throats is with like the way that things resolve in a specific order. So you can see somebody go for something and then know that you could go over here and it would preempt them, and then you would get the better action, if that makes any sense. Like, because they went there, they've kind of left themselves somewhat open. I think about like dominant species or Kalis, like the fact that this resolves in a set order. What does that add to Tribune?
It really heightens the sense of tension about knowing when you can afford the opportunity cost of making that placement to claim a faction. As I mentioned, one of the things that makes this game daunting to new players is usually the turn structure. It's it's one of the least elegant elements of the design. It's pretty clunky. First you place all the workers, then you resolve all the workers on the board, then you do all the takeovers in order from gladiators on down to senators, and then you get the faction benefits in order from gladiators to senators. And that part especially tends to throw people for a loop, and they forget all the time, and it's a little bit awkward. But a virtue of this is it's kind of the same way that Kalis does its chaining correctly. You get to sometimes make a bold play without the resources to back it up yet, on the hopes that you'll get it later. It also helps. It also is a function of what you want to telegraph to your other players when. What you think you can, what information you're comfortable with your opponents knowing about your intentions for the round. All of this is made possible by the fact that the actions don't resolve immediately when you place. And I think you could probably reorient the game if you really wanted to without doing it that way. But I'm glad that it's designed the way that it is. Have I answered your question, or have I just rambled incoherently like a madman?
Well, you did ramble like a madman, but I do appreciate it.
Fair enough.
I don't, Mark, I don't think that was any rambling. I think I was right there with you. And I agree that, yeah, you really did cover the question I was asking in a very cohesive and rambling way. But, you eventually hit all the points. It got there.
Nice.
It took you 6 rounds out of the 4 to 6, but you got there. It's okay.
Harsh but fair.
Well, TC, after sitting latently for most of this podcast, what do you have to say about your current interest in Tribune?
Well, I've always been interested in it simply because it's from the design of Democker, and that right there is a pretty strong pedigree to have. But listening to Mark talk about it, I've always had a big interest in playing this game, and it's just whetted my appetite. Now I'm gonna have to go on this binge, maybe do some math trades or some insanity to finally get my hands on this game. Now, Mark, you did say that there was that the Fantasy Flight was a reprint. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I mean it's the English edition. The Heidelberger merely had Fantasy Flight distribute the English translation of the game. I will tell you, however, that it is language independent. So if all you can find is a German copy of the base game and or the expansion, just grab it.
Well, which one would you recommend, actually, just out of curiosity?
Oh, the Fantasy Flight edition is entirely equivalent. It just has English components. They're the same card stock, the same everything, the same graphic design.
And did Fantasy Flight publish the expansion as well?
They did. It didn't look like they would. So this is a game where I acquired the German version, traded it, acquired the English version, acquired the German expansion, then traded that, and then acquired the English expansion. So I've gone through all 4. Effectively, this game, I purchased this game 4 times, basically.
Oh, must be that good. And I also see in our comments there was some question about the rule books. And I know fairly recently Fantasy Flight's gotten better about the rule books, but this is from a while ago. How are the rule books at least coherent? Are they structured well? Are they easy to grok the game with?
No, they didn't. Look, you can tell that this is a good game because Fantasy Flight had nothing to do with the design of this game. They didn't do anything. They just did the translation, and unlike Portal, they know how to translate a rule book. The same guys that published, for many years, the definitive version of Tigris and Euphrates, the definitive version of Colossal Arena. They know how to publish Eurogames on occasion. Back when they used to do that, but they don't really do that anymore. It's a perfectly comprehensible rulebook. I reread it because just to refresh my memory about how it was. I think it's fine. It's not. I don't see any major problems with it whatsoever. It's only one rule book, which is great. Fantasy Flight has this fetish for producing like 3 separate rules documents. So there's nothing that you can go down and consult to get all the rules in one place. I don't know why they do that. People seem to like it, but people are idiots. And yeah, the document is fine.
Okay, I was just curious because I know that in the past I have struggled with Fantasy Flight rule books.
That is a sign you're still sane, TC.
Well, that's good. That's good. Sometimes I really wonder about that. And this is someone who can get through a GMT rulebook fairly well.
That's because GMT produces a certain kind of games. What are they called? Good games.
You're that Joe? I love having you on, Mark. I love you.
I should say for context, I don't. The strange thing about GMT, I love GMT as a publisher, but they have less editorial control than most publishers. They have a designer, and sometimes they assign them a developer, and then they just produce something. And one GMT design might have nothing to do with another GMT design. So some of the best rule books I've read have come from GMT. Some of the worst rule books I've read have come from GMT. So although I love the company, they do also produce their share of trash. And for absolutely no reason, I will now mention that they all publish the Coin series, and then repeat that they also publish some trash.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great. Yeah, why not alienate anybody who you've won over? That's a good strategy.
Look, my job is to throw myself on the grenade of public opinion so you can look better, Joe. This is all for you.
Well, I would say that I don't know why then you started this with, a 75-minute coherent, like 150 words per minute rambling of not just rambling, but just like we went through each different point of this, Mark, and you really won me over towards everything, every little bit of it. So I and that's what's so weird about this. Going into this, I had already basically unloaded my opinion, my 3 plays, go in and give it a negative rating, which I don't even think I really did that. I just was, I was ready to move on because people in my group, it didn't stick, and I can see why it stuck for you. And I now know what direction to tell people, well, what's he doing? There's a level of opacity here that I think is becoming, it's that, that word, that term, people want, at least people that are in, that have got past, the sort of surface level. I like this because it looks cool and makes me feel like I'm playing in Rome. People that are wanting this level of like, there's tension here. There's, what are you going to go for? There's multiple paths to victory that actually have a meaningful difference and aren't just a pick your path early and stick with it. They really each sort of have different times when they're more useful. There's all these different topics you've won me over on. Why the drafting line is a two-player thing, but then it has this sort of balance, and the way that you can win over factions later on, all this stuff. And if you remember, Mark, when I first was taking over the Longview, you were one of my first emails I sent out, which was like, Mark, I remember you talking so much about Tribune, and I just want to know what you thought was so great about it. And you were like, I've tried before to say what I like about games, and I'm really best, what you said, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously putting words in your mouth, was I'm best with a game that I don't just feel good about, because all I have to say is I like it because it's good. And I'd have to say, Mark, that after all this, all that we've been through today, you were right. You don't know how.
It's important to me to be right, at least.
Just pull the rug out from under you. That was sarcasm, viewers. I know that you might not be watching my face, but I'm smiling big because I think it was a really great. It was an excellent description of all the different features that this game has to add, and with your own signature, mix it in with enough offensive, and jaw-dropping remarks to make sure that by the end nobody's even there to hear it.
Sure. Can I just say two more things though?
Absolutely.
You can say more than two if you want.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple points of personal privilege. One of them is, just for context, I'm very opposed to house rules. My threshold for house rules is very, very, very high. But I do have a minor house rule for Tribune, as brilliant as it is, and that is simply at the start of the game, everyone is dealt 6 cards and they keep 4 of their choice. And my house rule is that there are special cards in the game called leaders that give you a special takeover bonus when you use them to take over a faction. And the way that I play, and the way that I've played for a long time, is if during the initial 6 cards you're dealt, one of them is a leader, you have to exchange it for a non-leader from the deck. Because starting with a leader at the very beginning of the game, I find to be a little bit too determinative, especially the leader of the Vestal Virgins and the leader of the plebeians. Because if you those leaders effectively allow you to get a major and difficult victory condition on turn 1. The plebeian leader I've seen give turn 1 Tribune a lot, and after a few sessions like that, I find it unsatisfying. If you want to, if the leader shows up on the board, go ahead and take it, but there's an opportunity cost with that. If you get dealt a leader at the start of the game, that just seems unsatisfying. So that is Tribune. Despite the fact that it's a top 10 game of mine, I do have a house rule for it. So just for whatever it's worth, that's how I play. And the second thing is, just to sort of dovetail on some of your comments about the enduring nature of some of these brilliant games. For the past, I'd say probably about 5 years, especially 2 years, very, very pointedly, after I play a worker placement game, I say, why would I play this instead of Tribune? And I'm usually not able to come up with much of an answer. Feast for Odin was one of the first games in a long time where I was able to come up with at least something. And when I play an area majority game, I ask myself, why would I play this instead of El Grande? And yeah, I have yet to have an area majority game give me a reason to play it instead of El Grande. And these, I'm not going to say that Tribune is a classic on the level of El Grande. It was published 12 years after it. It didn't invent a genre the way that El Grande did, but it is a testament to these original compelling designs in very crowded fields that have stood tall in the test of time. And it's just a joy to come back to. It's like going back to an old friend and realizing that all those dalliances with those other younger games were just mistakes.
Wow. Yeah. Fills you with regret like only the greatest games can.
Indeed.
Well, I thought I was the person to reach that point in my board gaming career. That's rather reassuring. I thought I was a crotchety one.
That's just because TC, you play bad games. That's why you feel that way.
Oh, is it? Okay. Well, at least there's a reason now.
Well, no, there's a point. You reach a point in your sort of hobbyist career, for lack of a better term, where you start to make certain realizations. One of them is sometimes what you play is less important than who you're playing with. Another one is life is too short for games that are too long. Another one is life is too short to play these derivative games that are maybe have some minor thing that's different, but are basically retreads of things you played dozens of times before. And another is finding that proper balance between chasing the next new thing, which offers great variety, and returning back to those classics. And, you know, coming to grips with all these challenges in our hobby time is one of the things that makes this this an interesting hobby, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's an interesting carrot to chase after.
Yeah.
Wow, you made this incredibly deep, Mark, and I hate you for that. Why can't you just leave us with, you know, a whiff of a punchline? Why am I choking up?
It's
you're shallow.
I'm not comfortable with it.
I also can't leave you with a punchline because I'm not very funny on command.
I think you're mostly funny in response to my absolute unfunny and impossible statements. So I think it's kind of like
cute, Joe.
So yeah, what though, Mark? I don't think we've talked about El Grande yet. So we always seem to end with these. You know, we just had Tony from Heavy Cardboard on and seem to plan our next episode. I don't think there's been. Yeah. I think we've now got our next game planned, and I think the community behind the Longview has been asking for an El Grande episode. Sounds like your other Canadian friend here, Norm, is all about El Grande, and I myself have the big box sitting on there, so I feel like we've got some ammo in the tank here, Mark, so it's not going to be long before our viewers are going to get to hear, or our viewers and listeners are going to get to hear from you.
Do you like big box and cannot lie?
Yes, I do, Sir Mix-a-Lot. Yeah, you really. I'm not actually sure if I like the big box.
Talk about it. Yeah.
So it's great to hear from you, Mark, and I'd like to tell everybody that missed or was sleeping through the first part, or maybe TC's going to eventually cut it out because, you know, you never know what TC's going to leave in or not. He's basically just forming a whole bunch of things so he could then steal my identity and just, you know, be able to talk into a voice changer and then have every word on record.
Ooh,
but I wanted to
on. Way to go, man.
He's diabolical. I can never trust him. But
you are wise.
I don't think anybody who games with him does either. He is the computer virus from your favorite game, Mark, Twilight Imperium.
Oh god, I love the necrovirus. I love the necrovirus so much.
So I want to remind everybody to find you together with not just alone this time, but You Do So Wrong About Games, a board game podcast with a friend of yours you'd mentioned.
Mike Walker, yes. We both did video reviews, but we grew tired of the life, and we have faces that are best for radio. So we do a weekly podcast called So Very Wrong About Games. You can find us on your favorite podcast thing. You can find us on Facebook. We also are on Twitter at So Wrong Games, and that's what we've been doing lately.
Well, I can tell you right now, that's where I'm going to be going to, because you know, one dose is never enough, Mark, and that's why we're going to have you back. But this has been awesome, dude, and thank you very much for leaving me with this feeling that I need to play Tribune again, and then I need to send you a detailed geek mail with all of the things that you were wrong about, and that I know because I played it once more.
Look, in all sincerity, no sarcasm, it's been a joy and a pleasure. Thanks, Joe. You and TC provide a valuable insight into talking about games that were not released in the past 3 weeks, to giving them the amount of time to breathe, for respecting the fact that the loudest voice is not always the one to pay most attention to. Given that, I don't know why you invited me on, so clearly it was a temporary lapse.
Well, actually, I think we invited you on so I could, you know, get on your podcast and dig up like the crappiest game I can find, and we can discuss it. And you can just,
it's the necrovirus, man. You've been infected.
Well, I mean, maybe someday we can do a game face-off between Deadly Premonition and Twilight Imperium 4 and seeing which one's worse.
I got something that'd probably be worse.
I don't know, man. Does Deadly Premonition last 17 hours?
Well, it's random as all get out.
Yeah, as opposed to Twilight Imperium 4, where the action card you draw might be instantaneously hose someone for no good reason, or this is an incredibly situational benefit that you'll never take advantage of. Random like that?
Random as in six-sided die. We'll get into it. Yeah, I've got some nice. I mean, I've got such a stack of Kickstarters that I couldn't bear to get rid of because I didn't want to actually give them to anybody else.
I hear that. Yeah.
So
look, one of my I rag on randomness all the time, but one of my favorite games is Gunslinger, the Avalon Hill Richard Hamblin game from the 80s. And in that game, you can indeed get shot in the face in the first turn and be entirely knocked out. So
buddy of mine owns that, and they played it once, and it was just hilarious. Isn't it like the whole game? You play like an hour-long game, 2-hour-long game, and it's supposed to simulate like 20 seconds.
Each turn, actually, I think you've exaggerated the case. You've understated the case rather. Each turn of the game, each round, consists of 2 seconds of real time, and each round of the game is further subdivided into 5 action segments. So it is indeed the case that every action you take is a fifth of 2 seconds. So
40%.
Yeah, no, it's a look. If you've never played a game by Richard Hamblin, he's the guy who did Victory in the Pacific, Gunslinger,
Magic Realm, right?
Magic Realm and Merchants of Venus. He was a genius ahead of his time. Like many geniuses ahead of his time, he probably sorely needed a stronger editorial hand. But look, I will still play Gunslinger, Merchants of Venus, or Magic Realm any day of the damn week, warts and all, because that guy was some kind of freakish genius. And I like a lot of the old Avalon Hill games from that period, but his designs especially. Anyway, just to give, I don't mind randomness in some context, but if you're going to give me randomness, I want a visceral experience, and I want it to be something with a tight intensity rather than a slogging affair of nonsense and tedium. But I should
well, man. I think next week we've got a game of TI4, and I'm going to be like, hey guys, I'm as excited to play this as I am to play Tribune.
Yeah, by next week you mean all of next week, all 7 days of it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm gonna have to cancel everything else.
Mark. I never play there was what game was it? It's like Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. That literally takes weeks to play.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't play war games like that anymore. The longest the longest I do is about 8 hours, but and even those are usually the multiplayer ones. One of my favorite games is a very obscure Azure Wish game called La Révolution Française, La Patrie en Danger, which is a 6-player game about the French Revolution that lasts about 6 to 8 hours. Now that's some obscure nonsense going on right there.
Yeah, I also got it was a Richard Berg who did Alan Moon game called Warriors, which is absolutely the biggest train wreck of a game I've ever played in my life that I will never leave my collection. It's the only game I know of with an expansion where Dragon Fire is used purely as a defensive mechanism. Okay.
Nice. Richard Berg has done him some work over the years. That's definitely true. Yeah, and I remember when Alan Moon used to be a war game designer before he discovered the ways of little plastic trains.
Trains, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Joe, we should wrap this up before we get too far off the track.
Sorry about that. My fault.
You guys take this, man. Actually,
I could ramble for hours.
Get to the point where it was entirely in French.
Sorry, the French Revolution, the homeland in danger, I guess would be the translation.
Well, Norm, man, I kept wanting to say Mer because Mer's also in our chat. Norm gave you a très bien, très bien. I'm trying, man. I'm trying so hard. I had 1 semester, and that's it. And all I have is Romance language knowledge. But you know, it's
solamente en español.
And you're just going to have to check the chat for what he said, because I'm not going to say that one. All right. So, so it's been so great having you. Thanks, Mur. Thanks to Mur and Norm for joining us here, because you guys gave us some amazing input. And you guys were here throughout, giving us some things to go off of. And it sounds like you sold the game. You've already made 1 sale on the BGG marketplace to Mur, picking up Tribune with all that you said, Mark. So I leave that one to you. I think Mur tried to blame me, but I'm going to push that one onto you, man. You are responsible now for whether or not Mur likes that game.
Oh, boy. My refund policy is very strict in that I don't offer refunds, but I sincerely hope you enjoy it. And again, Joe, TC, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it a great deal. It's been a joy and a pleasure.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks for joining us, and catch us. Hopefully we'll be on here soon again to talk about El Grande or something else. You know, El Grande is going to be awkward because I've got Spanish, but you know what? Maybe I won't use that, but I probably will. You deserve it, but it's okay. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
A pleasure. Thank you again.
Bye, everybody. We'll catch you on the next Longview.